In the shadowed heart of Appalachia, nestled within a crumbling forest, there lies the skeleton of a once thriving mining town called Black Hollow. Few locals speak of it openly, and those who do utter its name only in whispers, as though the very mention might summon something vile. I learned about Black Hollow from a chance encounter with a grizzled park ranger named Wyatt, who warned me, "Don't go poking around there. Some places are meant to stay forgotten." But curiosity, as it often does, got the better of me. Armed with a camera, a flashlight, and a stubborn determination, I decided to explore Black Hollow for myself. The trail leading to the town was smothered by dense undergrowth, the air thick with decay and the sweet, sickly scent of rotting leaves. After hours of hiking, I finally saw it. Sagging rooftops protruding from the overgrown landscape like the jagged teeth of a dead giant. The town was eerily silent, save for the faint rustle of the wind through the trees. Buildings slumped against one another, their windows shattered like the vacant eyes of corpses. The faint remnants of faded signs, General Store, Black Hollow Saloon, clung desperately to the facades. Something was off from the start. Despite the stillness, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to shift just beyond my line of sight, and every snap of a twig made my pulse quicken. I chalked it up to nerves until I ventured into the town's church, drawn by the haunting sight of its steeple, now blackened and splintered, clawing at the gray sky. The air inside was heavy, suffocating. Pews lay overturned, and the pulpit was splintered as if some great force had torn through the place in a fit of rage. The walls were smeared with something dark and foul-smelling. It could have been soot, or something worse. I aimed my flashlight at the back of the room, where a grand, shattered stained glass window loomed, depicting an angel with outstretched wings. But the angel's face was gone, replaced by a jagged, gaping void. A sudden sound, the scrape of a shoe against wood, froze me in place. Whirling around, my flashlight beam darted across the room, illuminating nothing but dust motes swirling in the stale air. My rational mind insisted it was the wind, but the growing dread in my chest suggested otherwise. I decided to leave, but as I stepped out of the church, the daylight seemed dimmer, as though the sky itself had thickened with clouds. The woods around the town seemed closer, the trees leaning in with twisted, grasping branches. That's when I saw the first figure, a silhouette standing in the doorway of what appeared to be the town's old schoolhouse. It was a woman, her dress tattered and swaying as if caught in an unseen current. Her head was bowed, and her hair hung like a curtain over her face. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding far too loud and far too weak. She didn't move, didn't even flinch. I took a hesitant step toward her, but the figure dissolved into nothingness, like smoke dispersing into the air. My heart thundered in my chest. I wanted to run, but something compelled me to press on. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe it was madness. The schoolhouse was in worse shape than the church. Desks were overturned, and long-dead vines had snaked their way through shattered windows, curling around everything like skeletal fingers. On the chalkboard, faint marks remained, a childish scrawl that read, "Don't look up." Of course, I looked up. Suspended from the rafters was something that resembled a bundle of clothing at first glance, but as my flashlight illuminated it, the clothing resolved into the desiccated remains of a body, its face twisted into an expression of pure agony. The corpse swayed slightly, as though mocking my presence. I backed out of the building, my hands trembling so violently that I nearly dropped my flashlight. Outside, the town felt alive now, though not in any way that offered comfort. Whispers surrounded me, faint and indistinct, like 1,000 voices speaking just out of earshot. Shadows darted between buildings, and cold tendrils of air caressed my neck, making me spin in paranoid circles. I had to leave. But as I turned to retrace my steps through the forest, I realized with gut-wrenching horror that the path was gone. The woods had swallowed it whole, and with it any hope of escape. Panic surged through me, and I began to run, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Every direction seemed wrong. Every tree looked identical. Worse still, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Stay," they hissed. "Join us." At some point, I stumbled into a clearing where an ancient, rusted mine entrance gaped like a hungry maw. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And that's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the mine. Something began to emerge, its eyes glinting like hot coals in the suffocating blackness. I ran. Blindly, desperately I ran, the ground uneven beneath my feet and the sound of pursuit close behind. I don't know how long I ran or in what direction. When I finally stumbled out of the forest, gasping for breath and trembling, it was already dawn. The town was nowhere in sight, and I didn't dare look back. When I returned to the ranger station to tell Wyatt what I'd seen, his face turned pale. He sighed heavily and said, "You're lucky to be alive. Most folks who go looking for Black Hollow never come back, and the ones who do, they're never the same. I haven't been back since. But sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, I hear whispers outside my window, faint and chillingly familiar. Stay, they say. Join us." Nestled deep within a forgotten valley shrouded by mist and cloaked in perpetual gloom, there exists a place known to locals only as the Stairs. They're not marked on any map, nor spoken of in polite company. When I first heard the story during a camping trip, it was from an old man sitting by the fire. His voice quivered as he warned us, "If you ever find those stairs, turn back. Don't climb. Don't even look too long." But warnings like that have a way of embedding themselves into your mind, turning into a gnawing curiosity. A month later, armed with a camera and the bravado of ignorance, I returned to the valley to see if the stories were true. The forest was eerily quiet as I hiked, the dense canopy above swallowing sound and light alike. After hours of wandering, I began to doubt the tale altogether, until I stumbled upon them. Rising from the earth like a monument to nowhere, the stairs were real. Their steps, worn and moss-covered, seemed impossibly ancient. They were carved from black stone, so cold to the touch that even the midday sun couldn't warm them. But it wasn't just their presence that unnerved me. It was the unnatural stillness around them. The air was heavy, like a storm was about to break, and no birds or insects dared venture near. I felt as though I were being watched, not by an animal, but by the forest itself. Despite the unease clawing at my chest, I approached. The closer I got, the stronger the sensation became. My skin prickled, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I hesitated at the base of the stairs, staring up into the unknown. The stories came rushing back. People disappearing, strange sounds, shadowy figures that followed climbers home. But still I climbed. The first step was surprisingly easy, almost inviting. Then the second and the third. But by the fourth step, the air changed. It became colder, unnaturally so, and with each subsequent step, the world seemed to fall away. The trees grew distant, their forms dissolving into a gray haze. The whispers began on the seventh step, faint at first, like wind through leaves, but unmistakable. They grew louder as I climbed, overlapping voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I reached the 12th step and froze. A sound, a low, guttural moan, echoed from above. My flashlight, though pointed straight ahead, seemed unable to pierce the dark void that had swallowed the upper steps. That's when I saw it. Just beyond the reach of the light, something moved. It was slow and deliberate, its form indistinct but enormous, with limbs too long and joints that bent wrong. My rational mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but my body refused to move. The figure came closer, its movements jerky, as though it were learning how to walk. As it reached the edge of the light, I caught a glimpse of its face, or what should have been a face. It had no eyes, no nose, only a wide, lipless mouth that split its head nearly in two. Its teeth, jagged and wet, chattered incessantly, as if in anticipation. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in a voice that burrowed into my skull like icy needles. "Keep climbing," it hissed. "You've already been seen." I turned and bolted, taking the steps 3 at a time. The whispers grew frantic, a cacophony of screams and laughter chasing me down. The air around me crackled, and I could feel the thing just behind me, its breath cold and foul against my neck. When I finally reached the bottom, the world snapped back into focus. The gray haze was gone, replaced by the familiar greens and browns of the forest. But the stairs, they were gone. I didn't stop running until I was back at my car. As I fumbled for my keys, I glanced back at the tree line. The forest seemed normal again, but I could feel it watching, waiting. That night, as I tried to sleep, the whispers returned. They were faint but unmistakable, coming from the corners of my room, the closet, under the bed, and then I heard it, that same chilling voice, speaking just behind me. "You've already been seen." In the desolate stretch of Arizona desert, there's a place known to locals as the Empty Motel. No one knows who built it or when. It doesn't appear on maps, and it's said to be visible only to those who are truly lost. Truckers whisper of it over coffee in roadside diners, recounting tales of a glowing vacancy sign flickering on in the dead of night, summoning the weary. I was one of those unlucky souls who found it. It started on a road trip to visit a friend. My GPS lost signal, and my phone's battery died shortly after. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, the road little more than a cracked ribbon of asphalt under the moonlight. When the neon glow of the motel's sign pierced the darkness, I was too relieved to question its existence. The sign buzzed faintly, spelling out vacancy in flickering letters, and beneath it was a squat one-story building with faded stucco walls. Pulling into the gravel lot, I noted the stillness of the place. No cars, no noise, no wind, just silence so oppressive it made my ears ring. The air smelled faintly metallic, like blood or rust. The front desk was empty, a single bell sitting atop a dusty counter. I rang it once, twice, and on the third ring, a figure emerged from the shadows. The man who appeared was tall and gaunt, with a pallid complexion and dark, sunken eyes that never quite met mine. His movements were stilted, unnatural, as though he were a puppet jerked to life by invisible strings. "Room for the night?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. Before I could answer, he slid a key across the counter. A tarnished brass thing with a jagged edge. The tag read Room 6. I took it, hesitant but too exhausted to argue, and made my way down the dimly lit corridor. The air grew heavier with each step, the faint hum of fluorescent lights above mingling with an odd tapping sound that seemed to echo from nowhere. Room 6 was at the end of the hall. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room was ordinary. Faded wallpaper, a creaky bed, and a cracked mirror above a small wooden dresser. A faint, musty smell lingered in the air, but something was wrong. The window was bolted shut, yet a cold draft swept through the room. Shadows seemed deeper here, darker. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shrugging it off as paranoia, I locked the door, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The tapping sound I'd heard earlier was louder now, rhythmic and persistent, like nails drumming against glass. When I couldn't take it anymore, I sat up, scanning the room for the source. That's when I saw it. The mirror. It had fogged over as though someone had breathed on it, and faint words were forming in the condensation. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled toward the door, fumbling with the lock. But no matter how I twisted it, the door wouldn't budge. Behind me, the tapping grew louder, faster, until it sounded like 1,000 fingers rapping against the walls. I turned back to the mirror and my blood ran cold. My reflection was gone. Instead, I saw the room as though I were standing outside of it, peering in. And there, crouched in the corner where the shadows were darkest, was a figure. Its body was skeletal, wrapped in tattered rags, and its head was too large for its neck, lolling at an unnatural angle. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, jagged teeth glinting in the dim light as it grinned at me. Then it moved. The figure lunged forward, and as it did, the lights in the room flickered and died. I screamed, backing into the door as I clawed at the handle. In the suffocating darkness, the thing's raspy breathing filled the room, punctuated by the wet, slithering sound of its movements. Just as I felt its icy fingers graze my arm, the door burst open. I fell into the corridor, gasping for breath. The hallway was empty, the oppressive silence returning. I didn't look back as I bolted toward the parking lot. My car sat where I'd left it, but the motel was gone, replaced by an expanse of barren desert. To this day, I don't know if I dreamed it or if it was real. But every so often, when I drive late at night, I swear I see the flicker of neon in my rearview mirror, and I never, ever stop. There's a road in northern Maine called Black Pines Hollow, an unassuming dirt path that winds through an ancient forest. Locals warn against traveling it at night. They call it the Whispering Road, and the stories about it are enough to keep most people away. But one October night, I found myself driving down that very road, my phone dead and no other route available. The forest swallowed the weak glow of my headlights. The pines rose like jagged black spires, their branches so dense they seemed to block out the moonlight entirely. As I drove deeper, an unsettling stillness took over. No wind, no animals, just the crunch of gravel under my tires. Then the first whisper came. At first, I thought it was static on my car radio. But when I glanced at the console, the radio was off. The whispering continued, faint and indecipherable, like someone murmuring just beyond my hearing. I slowed the car, peering into the dark woods, but there was nothing. I shook my head, telling myself it was my imagination. Then the whispers grew louder. This time I could almost make out words, but they were distorted, like a voice underwater. I pressed on the gas, eager to leave the road behind, but as I sped up, the whispers didn't fade. They multiplied. Dozens of voices now, overlapping in a chaotic symphony, some shrill, some guttural. My hands gripped the wheel, sweat slicking my palms. Then I saw her. A woman in a tattered white dress stood in the middle of the road. Her hair was matted, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but her eyes glinted like wet glass in the headlights. I slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a stop just feet away from her. She didn't move. Heart hammering in my chest, I honked the horn. The sound blared through the night, but the woman didn't react. She just stood there, her head twitching slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. And then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed into the woods. A primal fear took over, every instinct screaming at me not to follow her gaze. But something in those whispers compelled me. I turned my head, looking where she pointed, and immediately wished I hadn't. The trees were no longer trees. Their bark twisted into grotesque shapes, faces etched into the wood. Eyes stared back at me, mouths stretched open in silent screams, and between the trunks, deeper in the shadows, figures moved. Pale, elongated forms that seemed to glide rather than walk. Their limbs were too long, their joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. The woman in the road let out a low, guttural laugh, the sound blending seamlessly with the whispers. I turned back to her, but she was gone. My car was surrounded now, the pale figures closing in. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. My heart pounded as they reached for the car, their fingers long and skeletal, scratching at the windows. I floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward. The figures screamed as I sped past, their voices high-pitched and unnatural. The road seemed endless now, the trees closing in tighter, their gnarled branches scraping against the car like claws. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, repeating a single word now, over and over, stay. Finally, the forest spit me out onto a paved road, the darkness giving way to the faint glow of a distant town. The whispers stopped and the oppressive silence lifted. I didn't slow down until I reached a gas station, pulling into the brightly lit lot and gasping for air. When I told the clerk what I'd seen, she paled. "You're lucky," she said, her voice trembling. "Most people who drive Black Pines Hollow never come out." I didn't sleep that night, and I haven't driven at night since. But sometimes in the quiet hours, I hear them again, those whispers, faint but insistent, calling my name. There's a story whispered in the Midwest about a small abandoned house tucked into the farthest corner of a cornfield. It doesn't appear on any map, and no one in the nearby town claims to have built it. Farmers warn their children to stay away, saying it's cursed. They call it the Crooked House. I didn't believe the stories. Urban legends, I thought, just tales to keep kids from wandering off into the fields. But one autumn, during a road trip with friends, we found ourselves stranded after a tire blew. We were miles from the nearest town, and as we trekked through the tall stalks in search of help, the house appeared. It was small, lopsided, and wrong. The windows leaned at impossible angles, the roof sagged as though something heavy perched on top, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood underneath dark and splintered. A single light flickered inside. "Maybe someone's home," my friend Jake suggested. He was always the first to act brave. The others agreed, though unease clawed at my stomach. Something about the house felt like a trap, but none of us wanted to spend the night lost in the cold. Reluctantly, I followed them up the creaking porch steps. Jake knocked on the door. It swung open immediately, as though we'd been expected. Inside, the air was thick and musty. The floor tilted slightly, forcing us to steady ourselves against the crooked walls. A single bulb dangled from the ceiling, its weak light casting jagged shadows that seemed to move. The furniture was sparse, just a table, 4 mismatched chairs, and a rocking chair that swayed gently as though someone had just vacated it. "We should leave," I muttered. My voice sounded distant, muffled by the oppressive quiet. But Jake called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" No answer came, only the faint creak of the rocking chair slowing to a stop. That's when the laughter started. It was faint at first, almost like a child's giggle coming from upstairs. The sound sent chills racing down my spine. It didn't feel playful. It felt malicious. Probably just raccoons or something, Jake said, though his voice wavered. He started toward the staircase, and against my better judgment, we followed. The stairs groaned under our weight, the sound echoing unnaturally, as though the house itself were alive. At the top, a long hallway stretched ahead, its walls warped and closing in like a funhouse illusion. Doors lined the corridor, all slightly ajar. "Which one do you think it's coming from?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting nervously. Before anyone could answer, the door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening bang. The laughter returned, louder now and closer. Jake, emboldened by fear or adrenaline, stormed toward the door. "This is stupid," he muttered. "It's probably just some dumb prank." He flung the door open, revealing a child's bedroom. A small bed sat against the wall, its faded quilt neatly tucked. A doll sat in the center of the bed, its face cracked and its eyes staring directly at us. On the walls, crude drawings were etched into the plaster, all depicting the same thing: stick figures surrounded by tall stalks being pulled into the ground by shadowy hands. Before any of us could react, the door slammed shut behind us. The bulb in the ceiling flickered and burst, plunging the room into darkness. The laughter turned into screams, high-pitched, inhuman wails that seemed to come from every direction. I felt something cold brush against my arm, and I screamed, scrambling toward the door. My friends did the same, and together we shoved it open and bolted down the hallway. The floor tilted wildly beneath our feet, and the house groaned as though it were collapsing around us. When we reached the front door, we didn't look back. We sprinted into the cornfield, the laughter and screams chasing us, growing fainter only when we finally reached the road. The car was gone when we got back, just an empty patch of dirt where it had been. We had no choice but to walk until we reached the next town, where a bemused sheriff listened to our frantic story. "You went to the crooked house," he said grimly. "You're lucky it let you out." When we returned the next day with a tow truck, there was no sign of the house. The cornfield stretched on, unbroken, as though it had never been there at all. But at night, in my dreams, I still hear that laughter, and I know someday it'll call me back. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and 3 friends hiking through the dense forests of Oregon, exploring trails that most tourists didn't bother with. Ryan, ever the adventurer, had heard about an abandoned mining town deep in the woods, completely untouched for decades. No maps led there, just rumors and vague directions passed between hikers. The idea thrilled us. An old ghost town hidden in the wilderness? We had to see it. The hike started early, the sun barely cresting the horizon. The forest was beautiful at first, with golden light filtering through the trees and the crunch of leaves underfoot. But as the day wore on, the air grew heavier, and the woods became unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just our footsteps and the occasional nervous joke to break the tension. After hours of trekking, we found it, the mining town. A dozen or so weathered buildings sat clustered around a central clearing, their wood rotting and roofs sagging under decades of neglect. A rusted sign, barely legible, read, "Welcome to Black Hollow." "This is incredible," Ryan said, pulling out his phone to take pictures. Completely untouched, we split up to explore. The air felt colder here, despite the warmth of the day, and the shadows seemed darker, longer. I wandered into what looked like an old general store. Dust coated the shelves, and cobwebs draped from the ceiling like curtains. The floorboards creaked with every step, threatening to give way. As I reached the counter, I noticed something strange, a row of footprints in the dust leading to the back room. Fresh footprints. "Guys," I called out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. No one answered. Curiosity overpowered caution. I followed the footprints into the back room. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On it sat an old doll, its porcelain face cracked and one glass eye missing. The remaining eyes stared at me, unnervingly lifelike. Something about it felt wrong, like it was watching me. That's when I heard the whispering. Faint at first, barely discernible over my pounding heart, but growing louder. Words in a language I didn't recognize. I spun around, expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank, but the room was empty. The whispers grew closer, circling me, though nothing was there. My chest tightened, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I bolted out of the store, my panic rising when I realized I couldn't see my friends. The clearing was empty. The other buildings loomed like watchful sentinels, their dark windows like eyes. "Ryan? Sarah? Jess?" I shouted, my voice echoing eerily. A scream cut through the silence, sharp and raw. It came from one of the larger buildings, a church, its steeple leaning precariously to the side. Without thinking, I ran toward it, pushing open the heavy, warped doors. Inside, the air was stifling, heavy with the scent of decay. Pews lay scattered and broken, and the altar was covered in strange carvings that looked like symbols or runes. Ryan stood near the front, frozen in place, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Ryan!" I called, but he didn't move. He just kept staring at the altar. As I got closer, I saw why. Behind the altar stood a figure, tall and thin, draped in tattered black robes. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its hands, long, bony fingers tipped with claw-like nails, clutched a staff made of twisted wood. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only it could hear. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening. The figure raised its head, and I saw it. A face with no features, just smooth, pale flesh. It turned toward us, its empty gaze locking onto Ryan. "Run," Ryan croaked, his voice barely audible. The figure took a step forward, its movements unnaturally smooth, as though it were gliding rather than walking. I grabbed Ryan's arm, yanking him back toward the door. The whispers turned to screams, high-pitched and inhuman, filling the air as we stumbled out of the church. Jess and Sarah were waiting in the clearing, their faces pale and stricken. "We need to go," Jess said, her voice shaking. We ran, not caring which direction, just wanting to get away. The forest seemed alive now, the trees twisting and closing in, their branches clawing at us. The whispers followed, relentless, whispering our names. When we finally broke free of the woods, the sun had set. None of us spoke as we piled into the car and sped away. That night, as I tried to sleep, I heard them again. Those whispers, faint but unmistakable, coming from the corners of my room. When I looked out the window, the woods seemed closer than they should have been, and in the distance, just barely visible, was a figure, tall, robed, and watching. We never spoke of Black Hollow again, but deep down I know we didn't leave it behind. Not entirely. The locals called it the Quiet Lake. Tucked away deep in the Appalachians, it wasn't on any official maps. I heard about it through an old camping forum where someone had posted a cryptic warning. "Stay away from the lake. It listens." I didn't believe in superstitions or ghost stories, but I loved exploring forgotten places. The idea of a hidden lake shrouded in mystery was too tempting to resist. So, one misty November morning, I packed my gear and set out. The trail was overgrown, barely a path anymore. The deeper I ventured, the quieter it became. Birds disappeared, the wind stilled, and even the crunch of leaves under my boots seemed muffled. After hours of hiking, I reached a clearing. There it was. The lake was stunning, a mirror-like surface reflecting the gray sky and skeletal trees. But something was off. No ripples, no movement. Not even the faint lapping of water against the shore. It was unnaturally still, like a photograph. As I stood there, a wave of unease washed over me. The silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive. I shrugged it off and set up camp near the shore. The quiet didn't scare me. It was peaceful. Or so I thought. That night I woke abruptly. My tent was cold, far colder than it should have been. My breath fogged the air. At first, I thought I'd heard something. A soft splash, maybe? I unzipped the tent, shining my flashlight toward the lake. Nothing. Just the smooth and glassy surface staring back. I was about to retreat back into the tent when I noticed something odd. My reflection wasn't moving. I blinked, thinking I was imagining it, but there it was, staring at me. My face in the water, still and unblinking, even as I waved the flashlight. Then it smiled, not my smile. Its grin was too wide, its teeth too sharp, stretching impossibly across its face. My blood turned to ice. The reflection raised its hand, mirroring my motion but slower, more deliberate. It pointed behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. My heart pounded as I turned back to the lake. My reflection was gone. I scrambled back into the tent, zipping it up tight. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I barely slept, clutching a hunting knife as if it would protect me from whatever was out there. The next morning, I packed my gear in record time. The lake looked the same as before. Calm, serene, and completely untrustworthy. As I started back down the trail, I felt it, the sensation of being watched. The trees seemed closer, their twisted branches reaching toward the path. Halfway back, I realized something horrifying. The forest wasn't silent anymore. A faint, rhythmic sound followed me, just beyond the range of my hearing. It was the sound of splashing water, footsteps matching my own pace. I ran. The trail blurred as I tore through the woods, branches clawing at my clothes. The splashing grew louder, faster, closer. I didn't stop until I burst onto the gravel road where my car was parked. Gasping for air, I glanced back. The trail was empty, the forest still. I jumped into the car and sped off, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was miles away that I let myself breathe. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my mind replaying the events over and over. When I finally got home, I avoided mirrors for days. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked too long, I wouldn't like what I saw. Weeks passed, and I started to convince myself it was all in my head. But last night, as I walked past a darkened window, I caught a glimpse of my reflection. It wasn't me. It stood still, watching, smiling that too wide grin, and then it raised its hand and pointed behind me. There's an old legend about a train station deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, long since abandoned and swallowed by nature. By nature. It's called Raven's Hollow Station, and locals say it was shut down after a series of disappearances in the 1930s. Passengers would board the train, but they never made it to their destination. Some say the train never stopped again, vanishing into the fog along with everyone aboard. I didn't believe in ghost stories, but urban exploration was my hobby. When I found out about Raven's Hollow through an online forum, I was intrigued. Pictures of the station showed crumbling platforms, graffiti-covered walls, and a rusting locomotive still on the tracks. It looked like the perfect place for a late-night adventure. I convinced my friend Paul to come along. He was reluctant, but I assured him it would be fun. We packed flashlights, cameras, and a crowbar in case we needed to pry open any doors. We arrived just before midnight. The station was eerie, even more decrepit than I expected. Vines crawled over the cracked walls, and the platform was littered with debris. The air was damp and carried a metallic tang. In the distance, the skeletal remains of the train sat in silence, its windows like empty eye sockets. "Creepy enough for you?" Paul joked, but his voice was tight. We started exploring, our flashlights cutting through the dense fog that seemed to cling to the station like a living thing. Inside the main building, the ticket booth was still intact, its glass shattered. Old posters on the walls advertised destinations that no longer existed. As we moved deeper, I felt a strange pull, like something unseen was urging me toward the tracks. "Let's check out the train," I said, and Paul reluctantly followed. The locomotive loomed over us, its once polished metal corroded and blackened. We climbed aboard, the steps groaning under our weight. Inside, the train was disturbingly pristine. The seats were intact, and the floors were clean as if someone had been maintaining it. But there was no sign of life. "What the hell?" Paul whispered. Then we heard it, a faint sound, almost like the soft hum of an engine. "That's not possible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The train had been out of commission for nearly a century. The hum grew louder, and suddenly the lights inside the train flickered on, bathing the carriage in a sickly yellow glow. The doors slammed shut behind us, and the floor shuddered as if the train were about to move. Panic surged. We ran to the nearest door, yanking at it, but it wouldn't budge. The windows wouldn't break, either, no matter how hard Paul struck them with the crowbar. The train lurched forward. "Stop! Stop the train!" Paul yelled, but there was no one to hear us. The engine roared to life, and the world outside became a blur of gray fog streaked with shadows. The carriage wasn't empty anymore. Figures began to appear in the seats, flickering like static on a TV. They were dressed in outdated clothes, suits and dresses from the 1930s. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, and their mouths moved silently, as if they were speaking words we couldn't hear. One by one, their heads turned toward us. Paul grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here!" We stumbled into the next car, but it was the same, rows of ghostly passengers staring blankly at us. And then, in the far corner, we saw her. A little girl sat alone, clutching a stuffed bear. Unlike the others, she wasn't flickering. She was solid, real. Her head tilted up, and she looked directly at us. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Before we could respond, the lights flickered again, and the train screeched to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing nothing but blackness outside. A cold wind howled through the carriage, carrying whispers that sent chills down my spine. The passengers began to rise from their seats, moving toward us with jerky, unnatural motions, their mouths stretched open in silent screams, their eyes glowing faintly. Paul grabbed my hand and we ran, racing through car after car, but the train seemed endless. The lights dimmed and the whispers grew louder, swirling around us like a cyclone. Finally, we reached a car that was different. Its walls were rusted, its seats torn, and the air was suffocating. A single door at the end stood open, revealing the station outside. Without thinking, we jumped, landing hard on the platform. The train vanished. We lay there, gasping for air, the station silent once more. But as we staggered to our feet, I realized something was wrong. The platform looked newer, cleaner. The vines were gone and the air smelled fresh. Footsteps echoed behind us. We turned to see a station worker in a crisp uniform staring at us, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "The last train to Ravens Hollow left years ago." I glanced back at the tracks. They were rusted and overgrown again, as if nothing had happened. But I could still feel it. The train hadn't let us go. Not completely. Even now at night, I hear it. The distant hum of an engine, growing louder, closer, and I know one day it'll come for me again.